History of English Poetry, Part 2. In this video, I shall explain the characteristics, the features of the Middle Ages, that is, the Middle English period. In the history of English literature, the Middle English period is from the 11th to 16th centuries. These are the Middle Ages. The beginning of the Middle English period was marked by the Norman conquest of England. So before Norman conquest, England was occupied by Anglo-Saxons. There were three groups of people: Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. So it is from Angles that the name English came. So the Norman conquest of England in the 11th century, it was an 11th century invasion. It happened in 1066. And the occupation of England by an army led by William the Conqueror. So this event had far-reaching effects on the language as well as the history of England. It was an event that was to transform the English language forever. As a result of Norman conquest, Norman French seeped into English, and English language got transformed. So you can imagine the changes that would bring when a foreign language enters another language. So English became a hybrid language. It is English and French existing together. So during this time, thousands of French words entered the English language. Following the Norman conquest of 1066, Norman French became the language of the upper classes and the courts. For courtly discussions and communication among upper classes, Norman French was used. So that exerted a huge influence on the English tongue. For over 300 years, French was the language of power, because that was the language of the people who invaded England. So French was the language of power. It was spoken by the royalty. French was spoken by aristocrats and high-powered officials. And some of them couldn't speak English at all. As a result, French became the language of the ruling class. But English language continued to be spoken by the uncultivated masses. They did not know French. So the uncultivated masses, the common people, they spoke English language. So the existence of French and English, Norman French and English side by side, resulted in what we call Middle English. The result of the Norman conquest of England was Middle English. So here on the right side in the image you can see the Norman England. Influence on poetry. So what are the influences of Norman conquest of England and also the intermingling of English and French? Let us see. English poetry took a significant turn after the Norman conquest of England. Anglo-Saxon poetry, that is during the Old English period, Old English poetry or Anglo-Saxon poetry, was strong and stubborn. We already studied the different poems, or we already looked into the various poems written during Old English period. Most of the poems dealt with heroes and their adventures. You can take the example, Beowulf itself talks about the adventures of the hero Beowulf. So in contrast to the Anglo-Saxon poetry of strength and stubbornness came the Middle English poetry. The Normans brought to England bright, romantic tales of love and adventure. This was in contrast to the strong and stubborn poetry of Anglo-Saxons. Romance became a popular literary form in the Middle English period. And this indicated the age to be chivalric rather than heroic. So these romances were mostly borrowed from Latin and French sources. They deal with the stories of King Arthur, a legendary King Arthur, the War of Troy, etc. So what is the difference between chivalric and heroic. Chivalric means it dealt mostly with knights, 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 like soldiers. They are brave, they are modest, they are pious, and they would rather betray their king than assault the honor of a lady. Whereas a heroic warrior, that is a hero or heroic warrior of the Old English period, they are brave, they're quick to anger, they are boastful. They would rather kill their own father than break an oath to their king. See the difference. A heroic warrior would kill a king rather than break an oath, whereas a chivalric knight would betray a king rather than assault the honor of a lady. So, warriors from chivalric epics are civilized men, in contrast to heroic warriors who are brutal men. Heroic warriors are brutal men, whereas chivalric knights are civilized men. Chivalric knights are willing to sacrifice their own dignity to treat a woman properly according to the code of chivalry. Whereas heroic warriors were loyal to their lords, loyal to their families, and often these loyalties conflicted. The loyalty towards family and towards lord. So that forced them to wage war against their own family members, heroic warriors. Whereas chivalric knights, from the high Middle Ages, they were faithful to their mothers. They were faithful to their manners and faithful to their individual souls. So this chivalric nature was peculiar of the Middle Ages or Middle English poetry. That is why Middle English poetry was chivalric rather than heroic. Apart from romances, other principal genres were the chronicle. The chronicle is a historical account of facts and events arranged in a chronological order, like a timeline. So the chronicle, the saint's life, and other moral literature were the other principal genres of the Middle English period. And poetry at this time was dominated by brief, emotive, that is highly emotional lyric poems and fantastical chivalric romances. The subjects chosen for poetry were liberal religious faith, morality, chivalry, and love. Early Middle English. This period is from 1100 to 1250. So during the early Middle English period, religious writing predominated. The language of the court was Anglo-Norman. It is an intermingling of English and Norman French. And poetry was typically written in rhyming couplets after the French fashion. That was the French fashion, rhyming couplets. So English followed the French fashion, rhyming couplets, meaning couplet meaning two lines. So rhyming couplets, A, B, B, C, C, like that. Rhythm and rhyme replace alliteration as the distinguishing characteristic. So in the Old English period, alliteration was the main feature or characteristic of poetry. But in the early Middle English period, rhythm and rhyme replaced alliteration. And religious and didactic poems predominated the period. So religious poems dealing with religion and didactic poems. What is meant by didactic poems? They are different forms of art and literature. Didactism includes different forms of art and literature, that they should convey information and instruction along with pleasure and entertainment. So didactic art means along with pleasure and entertainment, it should convey some moral, some information, some instruction. That is meant by didactic or didactism. Early Middle English poems. Let us say some of the early Middle English poems. First one, Cursor Mundi, Runner of the World, meaning Runner of the World. It was an important, anonymous, long religious epic relating the history of the world in the Old and New Testaments. Old and New Testaments, two versions of the Bible. The poem Cursor Monday consists of 30,000 lines. Another poem is The Prick of Conscience. It's a Middle English poem dating from the first half of the 14th century. The poem promotes penitential reflection, that is regret, or that is expressing atonement or penance. A poem promoting penitential reflection on the themes of death, judgment, heaven, and hell. Another important poem is The Owl and the Nightingale. It's a popular poem written probably in the 13th century. It's an argument between the owl and the nightingale on the subject of the relative beauty and merit of their songs. The poem is attributed to Nicholas de Guilford. It is again a matter of conjecture. That is, it's not sure whether Nicholas himself wrote the poem. It's an earliest example of a literary form known as debate poetry. So as I told, it's an argument between the owl and the nightingale. The owl represents wisdom, and the nightingale represents light-heartedness. The poem shows us the spirit of the period. I told that it is a debate poetry, a debate poem. The nightingale opens the debate. The nightingale scolds the owl as a creature of the night, a bird that loves the dark and hence is evil. And the owl initially responds by suggesting that the dispute should be settled according to the traditional show of force. That was a solution that the delicate nightingale quickly dismissed. Instead, the nightingale continues her attack, claiming the obvious superiority of her voice. So considering what the voice, that aspect, the nightingale is superior through the owl. And the owl again possesses extraordinary wisdom. So this is how the debate goes on, and the debate leads to no solution. So these are some of the important early Middle English poems. The Age of Chaucer. Chaucer, the poet, lived during the Middle English period. This Age of Chaucer was a period of transition and turbulence. In every walk of life, there were signs of change. There were social, political, religious, and literary changes. In short, it was an age of change. And this period was a meeting ground of two divergent periods. The medievalism was departing and modernism was developing slowly. So whenever one period gives way to another, there will be a period of transition, where both the characteristics of the preceding age and the succeeding age exist together. Such periods are usually called transition ages or transition periods. So this was the meeting ground. The Age of Chaucer was the meeting ground for the two divergent periods, medievalism and modernism. During this period, language of the court shifted from Anglo-Norman to Middle English. However, the language used in this period was still not the English of our time. It is different. Again, it will be difficult to read Middle English, but not as difficult as it would be when we attempt to read an Old English poem. And English came to its own because of the great works of poets, writers like Chaucer, William Langland, and John Wycliffe. They were some of the important writers of the Middle English period. Alliterative revival. The 14th century witnessed the revival of alliteration. It was called the alliterative revival. So I previously mentioned that during the early Middle English period, rhythm and rhyme replaced alliteration. But towards the middle part of the Middle English period, alliteration came back. Alliteration was revived. Langland, William Langland and the Pearl Poet. The Pearl Poet were the two alliterative poets of the 14th century. William Langland wrote the poem Piers Plowman, and another poet, the Pearl Poet, the date or year of death is unknown. Nothing is known about the Pearl Poet. He is known as the Pearl Poet because he wrote the poem, The Pearl. He is also called the Gawain Poet. The Pearl is an elegy in about 1200 lines on the death of a little girl. It's a mystical poem of much beauty. In the poem, a bereaved father sees a vision of his daughter among the glorified. In the poem, the narrator wanders through a garden containing the grave of his infant daughter. And suddenly he has a vision of paradise, vision of paradise lying beyond a river. And immediately he recognizes the adult woman seated there as his daughter. And the daughter scolds him for his extended grief, and she describes her situation. That is how the poem The Pearl goes. And another poem, the Pearl Poet wrote another poem titled Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. It is also an alliterative poem. Geoffrey Chaucer. The most famous poet of the period is undoubtedly Geoffrey Chaucer. He is known as the father of English poetry. His main work is Canterbury Tales. It is a chivalric romance. He took the theme of chivalric romance and brought it into the everyday lives with stories of common people. He was the most famous poet of this age, and in religion, love, and society, he looked for idealism. Troilus and Crusade is a poem by Geoffrey Chaucer. It deals with faithlessness in love, suggesting idealism in man-woman relationship. He excels in the use of meters and rhyme. His language is very lucid and rhythmic. The death of Chaucer and the Barren Age. This period is from 1400 AD to 1485 AD. The Barren Age. In this period, there was no real improvement of English literature. It is after the death of Chaucer in 1400. So this period is called the Barren Age of English literature. There was no improvement of English literature. The age witnessed a lot of political changes, and there were many rebellions. Rebellions such as Cade's Rebellion, Wars of the Roses. Wars of the Roses was a series of civil wars. So to conclude, the Middle English period was highly influenced by the Norman conquest of England, which resulted in the intermingling of English and French languages. Then it was chivalric in nature rather than heroic. Then in the early Middle English period, rhythm and rhyme replaced alliteration, but alliteration came back. It was revived later, the alliterative revival. And then we have the Age of Chaucer, then the death of Chaucer and the Barren Age.